Okay. So I'll just quickly get started. Today's webinar is themed Building Feminist Alliances for Trade Justice and towards Trade Justice towards radical economic healing and rebuilding. And we are organizing this as part of the CSW 70. It is a virtual event that is being hosted by FEMNET, Regions Refocus, and Third World Network. And we are very glad to have you here. So today's conversation is basically framed around the context that across the world we are witnessing growing resistance. We are witnessing increasing resistance to free trade agreements as instruments of neoliberalism. And this is a growing feeling that has continued to affect the livelihoods of people, impact the environment, and every day it is becoming harder for us to ignore. So we are hosting this interactive workshop, and we will be using popular It's My Video because it says maintenance table and a series of short explainers to unpack the key trade issues from a feminist perspective, but to also help us all understand how issues they organize around are connected to global trade and why trade is a feminist issue. And to take us through this conversation, I have a great panel of speakers who I will be introducing later. But for the start, I'd like to have Erica from Regions Refocus to provide a welcome and introduction on behalf of the Gender and Trade Coalition, and also lead us through an interactive exercise just to kickstart the conversation. Erica, over to you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much, Grace. My name is Erica Levinson with Regions Refocus. I'm filling in for my colleague Anita Nayar, who could not be here today. But I've been working closely with the Gender and Trade Coalition for a few years now, but it was initiated before I had that privilege. So credit goes to the fantastic women who have built the work that I will tell you about. It's such an honor to be able to work hand in hand with them and to be able to build on their work. So I just wanted to highlight that before I get into this herstory of the Gender and Trade Coalition because it's a history of their work, of shared work. I won't go into too much detail about the different events, but there's much more information on all of this on our website, which we'll link at the end of the workshop. So the coalition was initiated in 2018 at a meeting that Regions Refocus and the South Center convened on the margins of the 62nd Commission on the Status of Women, or CSW 62. The participants agreed to confront the co-optation of women's rights by the WTO and to lift up a feminist agenda for trade justice, and an interim working group was formed, and we wrote a unity statement that organizations could endorse to become a member. The coalition today has 326 organizational members. It was officially launched in 2019 after electing a steering group and co-chairs representing feminist organizations and allies from every region of the world. And as part of the coalition, we've engaged in various different spaces, including CSW, the WTO, and UNCTAD. So from 2020 to 2022, member organizations hosted an 8-part webinar series called Trade Justice in the Time of COVID-19. If you explore our website, you'll see on the homepage a short video of highlights from these webinars. In 2021, the coalition was invited by the government of Barbados to substantively shape the inaugural Gender and Development Forum at the 15th quadrennial of the UN Conference on Trade and Development, or UNCTAD 15, and the statement that was produced was the basis for the outcome, the Bridgetown Declaration. In 2022, the coalition wrote an open letter to the WTO Director General and delegates ahead of the 12th Ministerial Conference. In mid-2023, we convened a roundtable at the 32nd International Association of Feminist Economics Conference, entitled Envisioning Feminist Alternative Trade Systems, following the coalition's third strategy meeting in Cape Town, South Africa. We kicked off 2024 with our first public members call with over 100 members joining virtually, and it was a three-part interactive event, including a teach-in on gender and trade, a stock-taking of current trade policy through a critical feminist lens, and plans for upcoming advocacy arenas. Over the course of 2024, we released a series of 4 feminist trade explainer articles unpacking how trade intersects with key feminist issues, covering gender, post-conflict recovery, migration, and climate. The series was produced by Regions Refocus for the Gender and Trade Coalition, and each article was developed in collaboration with different coalition members. You'll get to hear from some of the authors today. And in addition to being published on our website and shared by members across social media, the Heterodox blog Developing Economics republished each of our explainers. Ahead of the 15th AWID Forum at the end of 2024, we convened our 4th strategy meeting with GTC members and allies. And at the forum, we convened an interactive workshop, much like this one, to deepen understanding of why trade is a feminist issue and connect trade to other feminist issues. And much how we are in this workshop, we used our explainers there as tools for building shared analysis. That brings us to 2025. To start the year, we convened an online webinar attended by more than 100 participants from around the world to discuss the latest turbulent episode of the global trading system's impacts on different thematic areas and regions from a gendered lens. We convened a second webinar in the series in September on trade and militarism, which looked at the gendered intersections of the current global trade turbulence, heightened geopolitical tensions, and militarization. In June 2025, ahead of the 4th International Conference on Financing for Development, or FFD4, where several of us were engaged, we launched the Feminist Trade Agenda. And this agenda holds 16 policy proposals aimed at advancing collective efforts towards feminist trade justice based on the policy proposals put forward in the Feminist Trade Explainer series from 2024. In October 2025, we co-convened Shaping Whose Future, a side event at the 16th quadrennial of the UN Conference on Trade and Development, or UNCTAD 16. And at that event, we presented a feminist analysis of the gendered intersections of trade and debt justice and voiced feminist demands to achieve them. It's not on here, but we're currently preparing to engage in some advocacy around the upcoming 14th WTO Ministerial Conference in Cameroon, which will be held at the end of this month. So stay tuned for materials around that. And now that I've shared a little bit about the Gender and Trade Coalition with this herstory, and before we listen to presentations from our wonderful, wonderful speakers, we thought we could move to an interactive exercise. And my colleague Mariana will share a whiteboard with all of us. We want to get everyone thinking about how trade has impacted their lives, and more specifically, any impacts they've seen on women. Mariana, if you could share the... So if you could all please answer the question that you see at the top of this whiteboard. How is trade related to issues facing women in your community, country, and or region? These may be things you've observed in your personal life, in organizing, in your professional life, anything. You can write your response on a sticky note on the board. You can take some time to think of your answer, and even if you think something is related but you're not sure, please don't be shy. Jot it down. You can also put down more than one thing if you like. And if your answer is already up there, you can just add a plus sign beneath it. We'll give everyone about 5 minutes to think on this and put down their answer before we start to go over the different answers together. So you can see we added some sticky notes to get us started, but if they fill up, you can feel free to add more as you need. So please go ahead. Maybe 30 more seconds if anyone is still thinking of something and wants to write it. Okay, I think we can start going over the answers together. Um, okay, we can wait for this last note to be written. But we can see all the different areas that people are noticing trades impacts about the way that women are involved in trade, about ISDS, about digital trade, about trade liberalization, union busting, export manufacturing, tariffs, which are one of the main trade tools, also has been pushed to the forefront by the recent trade chaos, access to food, productive resources, um, violence against women, how trade impacts that. I think that this is a really rich sticky note board. This is a very rich array of comments, and it shows that trade has impacts on many, many, many issues that are not necessarily solely economic. So that's why we're always saying gender trade and gender trade and migration, gender trade and climate, gender trade and conflict. Um, and I think this is a wonderful way to get into the presentations that we'll have today. Thank you all very much for engaging with us, and we hope that you continue to think about these connections and that the presentations you hear deepen what you're already thinking about. So now it's my pleasure to pass the floor back to Grace to move us along.
Thank you so much, Erica, for leading us through that very insightful exercise. So we'll now get into the panel discussion, and I have three panelists. And the first speaker for the day is Mariama Williams, who is a global Afro-descendant who is from the Global Afro-Descendant Climate Justice Collaborative. And she'll be speaking to us today about gender and trade. And Mariama, I would like to hand over to you.
All right. So good morning, good afternoon, good night, everyone. Thank you to the organizers for organizing this timely webinar. And thanks for all of you for participating, because I know CSW has multiple events. I was just in New York myself, just physical and virtual events. So thank you so much for coming out for this. All right, so this Building Feminist Alliance for Trade Justice Towards Radical Economic Healing and Rebuilding session. It's very, very important, very timely. And I'm going to talk to it in two parts. I'm going to talk about the global moment, trade in a time of crisis, and then get down deeper to the nitty-gritty of how gender and trade relate. And then later on, we'll connect it to other areas. But before I move forward, I just want to say that the intellectual legacy of this work on gender and trade, just to give some kudos, I like to flag the work of Susanna Jokes and Ann Weston, who put the first publication out, Women and the New Trade Agenda, in I think in the late 1990s, really linking with the new trade agenda to what was going on with women. And also the work of one of my favorite professor, who is now passed and an intellectual giant in the feminist movement, Nela Porobić, who did a seminal work in 2001 looking at trade, gender, and poverty. And since then, there has been many, many such more. But these women have laid the thinking on how we begin to conceptualize gender and trade. The activism around it came up around a women's strategic seminar on gender and trade that was called in 1999 by the Center of Concern with another luminary who is not with no longer with us, Maria Riley from the Center of Concern, and another luminary from the Caribbean, Peggy Antrobus, who is still alive and going strong. And we strategized on how to move this into the advocacy arena. And that built on work that was done by other women's organizations, We Do and many other organizations, since at least 1997, following the WTO and the Hong Kong ministerial, and then strategizing after the Seattle ministerial in 1999 to create the Gender and Trade Network, which then phased out. And so we're very happy and very proud to be part of the Gender and Trade Coalition. But you want to know that this work has been ongoing since at least in the 1990s, activating especially when the WTO came into being. So that, there's a long history to it. All right, and I want to give a shout out to my colleague Butch Montez, who's one of the male economists who have been very, very supportive, helping us think through analytically and empirically and helping us refine and shape some of these concepts about looking at gender and trade, particularly in interventions around UNCTAD and the institutional framework. So thank you very much, Butch. All right, so my first part, the global moment. So we're not in a normal trade cycle, normal. We can debate what that means. We're in a moment shaped by overlapping crises. We have the war against Iran, which is disrupting energy market, increasing fuel prices, raising transport costs, amplifying inflation in import dependent economies, and generally driving up food and energy prices, disrupting supply chains, and I could go on and on. That's on top of the war in Ukraine, which itself disrupted food, fertilizer, energy market. And then that's on top of the ongoing devastation in Gaza and the rising instability in the Middle East and the destruction of women's and children and men's lives in Gaza and in the Middle East. And now we have the trade, and then we have with the occurrence of Trump 2.0, the escalating tension with Iran, of course, but trade conflict and tariff escalation, which has not stayed just with the US, but spreading out among major economies, intensifying competition over critical minerals. At the same time, following COP30, and we'll talk about trade and climate later on, we saw that there has been a lack of a hesitancy about resolving how the transition will be financed and governed equitably, as well as lack of commitment to phasing out of fossil fuel, for which Colombia is putting a conference together that will occur later on next month, looking at the phase out of fossil fuel. The result of all of that is that the global trade system is under pressure, fragmenting, politicized, and increasingly unequal. Now, we knew all of that from before. It's just that we see it more concretely and more, the curtains have been pulled back in many ways. So global trade is shifting from a quote rule-based system to a fragmented, power-driven, security-oriented system with profound implications for inequality, climate justice, and sovereignty. Why does gender matter? because trade is often and still presented as gender neutral, technical, and inevitable. When we talk about trade, we often talk about tariffs, markets, and supply chains. But we rarely talk about the bodies and the communities that sustain these systems. Behind every export industry lies an invisible infrastructure. Women's labor, women's care work, women's community leadership. That is why gender must be central to any conversation about trade justice. We're often told that trade connects the world. But today, trade is not simply connecting us, it's reordering power, redistributing risk, and redefining whose lives matter. And nowhere is this more visible than in the lived realities of Caribbean economies and Afro-descendant communities in Latin America and other places. I think feminist political economy has shown for decades that the global trade system is deeply gendered and that it rests largely on invisible foundations. Trade rules are built on invisible labor system. These systems rely heavily on women's work and care economies, and they reproduce colonial hierarchies and of extraction. It runs on women's labor that subsidize the global economy through unpaid care work, informal labor work, low-wage export industry, and agricultural subsistent works. So that this has become almost a stylized fact that trade is not gender neutral. So that we see, to the extent we see even the WTO and other entities who hitherto denied it are now having their own gender and trade approach to this. We know that women's labor is concentrated, remains in garment production, electronic assembly, tourism service, agricultural service, export, all of which rely on low wage, flexible labor, and weak protection. And women work continue to be the shock absorber for global competition. So the gender nature of trade goes beyond formal employment. Yet these contributions still remain unrecognized in trade governance. So when we talk about trade justice, gender cannot be an add-on, it must be a structural lens. Across global value chains, from garment factories to tourism to agricultural exports, women are there. They're doing all this work. If you look at areas in the Caribbean, Africa, and Latin America today, trade pattern cannot be separated from colonial history. Plantation economies were built on the extraction of land labor through a system of slavery and colonial domination. These structures continue, and we see a resurgence and even a whole rhetoric about recolonizing and redistributing the powers from Europe and the US. Women in these contexts are often at the front line of resilience, managing food system, organizing community recovery, and social networks after disasters. Yet their leadership is rarely reflected in decision making. So let's talk a little bit into the gender dimension of trade. So I just flag it for those of us, our newer colleagues who may not be so fluent in the language of gender and trade, just a little bit. So first is the feminized labor in global supply chain. We know that women, as I said before, are concentrated in garment, electronics, and tourism. And there's limited protection and there's precarious condition. And it's attained. One of the newer area that's been flagged by many of researchers and scholars right now is the care economy as an invisible subsidy to the global trade system. So we know that trade liberalization, which is to reduce tariffs, technically, we're in a reverse of that. Now, traditionally, trade liberalization is about opening up market by reducing tariffs and freeing goods across border. When that occurs, it reduces public services and that shifts cares to the household. And women have been historically absorbing this through increasing unpaid care work, through increasing their food provision, and increasing their community survival work. So care work sustains the global economy. And I would argue that the data still shows that in this atmosphere of rising tariff or tariff escalation, these things still attain. So whether tariff is going up or going down, these three fundamental factors remain that women labor is a shock absorber to the system. Third element is the land and food system. So trade rules contribute to land concentration, export agricultural expansion, and displacement of some small farmers. And women are the majority of small farmers. and they face barriers to land ownership, credit, and market access in many places, and yet they remain central to food security. So these structural patterns explain how trade reproduces gender inequality, right? That leads us to this bigger picture of export-led development, which relies on feminized labor, which is still dominant across any region of the world, across global supply chains, which are now the new fancy term, conceptual. We see concentration of women in the same set of industries, garment, electronics, and so forth. Um, when we see trade liberalization or trade protection, which is the atmosphere we're in now, we find again that tariff falls on social spending decisions, public services decision, and women again absorb these gaps through unpaid care work, include caring for children, supporting the elderly, food provisioning. So these trade policies restructure entire care system and the trade rules that influence the use and nature of agricultural land, which is intersecting now with climate factors, which we'll talk about, which are increasing the vulnerability of women in terms of which crops are are climate sensitive and which are not, which are being promoted, which crops are contributing to loss of land because of monoproduction or biofuel production, who and which group are losing sovereignty over land and seed, and who is losing access to credit and markets as a result of intensification of both trade rules, um, state violence, as well as climate change. And yet women still remain central to food security and biodiversity preservation. So when we talk about feminist trade justice, what do we mean and what needs to change? I think Feminist Alliance are calling not simply for inclusion, but transformation. Three major shifts have been occurring and emerging and re-emerging. One now, latest, is recognizing the care economy, that trade governance must acknowledge that care work is foundational to economic infrastructure, and policy should therefore integrate care into economic planning, protect public service, invest in care services. And without this, trade will continue to externalize social cost onto women's body. And the care economy is subsidizing global trade, right? The second is to reclaim policy space, and that's both at the level of governance, the level of institutions, and the level of micro and meso level. So we know for a very long time that many countries have lost policy autonomy through trade agreements, investment agreements, intellectual property rules, and feminist movements have been demanding policy space for food sovereignty, for gender sensitive and poverty eliminating industrial development policy, policy space for gender responsive economic strategies. Because without these policy space, gender equality becomes less possible. Those who work on global value chain have been pushing that supply chains must move away from extraction towards fair wages, labor rights, corporate accountability, equitable value distribution, and that women's workers must have collective bargaining rights, leadership roles, and so forth. And then there are the group of us who work on the intersectionality of gender, race, and colonial legacy, particularly in Latin America, the Caribbean, Africa, that argue that trade inequality are not just gendered, they are also shaped by colonial history, racial hierarchies, and extractive economic models. For Afro-descendant communities and indigenous peoples, trade systems have historically dispossessed land, extract labor, marginalized knowledge system. So any radical economic healing, therefore, requires historical repair. This must include reparative economic policy, community sovereignty, and recognition of traditional economies. Feminist Alliance as a political force around the world are aligning with sectors from climate justice movement to food sovereignty network to regenerative economics to food labor union to indigenous movement and to debt justice campaign. These alliances recognize that the crisis we face, economic inequality, ecological breakdown, and social fragmentations, are interconnected, and that trade justice therefore cannot be addressed in isolation. I think one of the most powerful development today is the growing convergence of movement. trade justice, with climate justice, with economic justice. And I think this theme of radical economic healing is particularly important because it suggests that we're not only dealing with policy failures, we're dealing with historical wounds, centuries of colonialism, racial capitalism, gendered exploitation, shaped in the global economy we inhabit today. So that healing requires rebuilding economic
Mariama,
system. Yes,
may request you to
rebuilding
moderate
economic
a little
system.
bit.
And that's kind of my closing there. Rebuilding economic system. Yep. Yep.
Okay, thank you for that. And I'm sorry for cutting you short as
That's
well.
okay. That's okay, my dear. Thank you. Mhm.
Okay, so we have our next speaker, but thank you so much for sharing those insights. He spoke a lot about why gender matters and how the trade system indeed is gendered and how it's running on the level of women. And I think those are some key points for us to continue reflecting on. So the next speaker is Ranja Sengupta, who is from the Third World Network, and she will be speaking to us about the intersection between gender trade and climate. Ranja, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Grace. And I think I agree with Mariama that this is very timely because we are really, trade is, of course, in the news for the wrong reasons, actually. And then, of course, we are in an era where we are seeing rapid climate change. We are seeing the discourses on sustainability coming across all fora, but we are also seeing a lot of confusion, a lot of doublespeak, a lot of false solutions. So let me just take you through some quick ideas, points related to trade and climate, and in a way looking through the gendered lens. And thanks to Mariama, I think most of what I say, I don't even have to make the connections to women's lives and their rights and so on, because Mariama has already kind of discussed it so well. But so all of you know, so we have the WTO for the multilateral trade agreements and negotiations. Now we have a host of bilateral trade agreements and regional trade agreements. And then we also have these investment treaties, which is to foster so-called facilitate foreign direct investment, which gives investors a lot of rights actually over national citizens. So all of these trade agreements together, they actually represent a system of legally binding rules. Why are the trade agreements so scary? Because if governments do not implement them, if they do not go by the commitments, they can be sued, and then different actions can be taken against them. And not the Trump way, because Trump is doing it all based on his own ideas and his own kind of, very aggressive positioning. But even under the trade rules, these are actually legally enforceable. But you will see that for a long time, both climate activists, trade activists have argued that these trade agreements have a lot of adverse impact on the environment, on sustainability, on climate actions, and so on. So I'll just give a few quick examples. For example, when the developed countries have massively subsidized their agricultural production, and then they have dumped it in developing countries. This has really impacted small farmer production, their own survival and livelihoods. And you know that women in developing countries are really engaged as small farmers. You will see very few rich women farmers in developing countries. They are really, in fact, they are producing and working without any resources almost. So more marginalized, smaller farmers, including women farmers, indigenous farmers and all, are hurt most. And then, of course, this has also a direct impact on climate, because it eliminates, we've often seen, these big industrialized production of even agricultural products comes and gets dumped. It really kills the local varieties, which is really important for biodiversity. Then we've seen the intellectual property rights in these trade agreements. We've seen a bit in the WTO through the TRIPS agreement, But very, very aggressively, these have been pushed in the bilateral and regional trade deals. For example, many of these agreements, including Trump's current tariff deals, and I'm from India. We signed one with EU. So EU, especially in its other agreements, and the US also, even before Trump, they forced partner countries, especially developing countries, to sign on to this global seed treaty called UPOV 1991. This is designed by seed companies, and they prevent farmers from, naturally exchanging, saving, and reusing seeds. This is the traditional way of our cultivation. So not only has it killed these traditional ways of cultivation, which are naturally more sustainable, climate resilient, and so on, these have also affected biodiversity. They've led to monoculture, and all of this we know has had tremendous impact on the climate. And women are seed keepers. Women actually have played a historically important role as seed savers, seed keepers. So it really undermines that role. Then we've seen that, the TRIPS agreement, it led to biopiracy, stealing of a lot of genetic material, and that has actually threatened small farmers across developing countries. Then one thing really that we've seen again and again, and there are many other impacts from trade agreements and investment agreements, but I wanted to really focus on this, is the role of extractives. And now you are all seeing the huge rush for critical minerals, right? In the name of sustainability and sustainable production, but basically it's a critical mineral grab. Trump is very, very aggressive on it. But even before Trump, this critical mineral grab was kind of getting, more and more impetus. And mainly it's the rich countries, they want critical minerals from global South countries. And even before that, even other raw material, other minerals were all in demand. And there are these things called investment treaties, which I was talking about, bilateral investment treaties or investment agreements, which have tried to open up. Like, so foreign mining companies would come, they would grab your critical minerals, your natural resources, but these agreements were designed in a way that their rights were really protected. So if a government, for example, wanted to take, measures against them for, say, pollution or for natural resource grab, the provisions had a dispute settlement function, many of you know, and which came up in the board, of course, the ISDS, the Investor State Dispute Settlement System, where companies, these foreign companies, just if you take any action against them for, unsustainable actions, then they can actually sue you using this ISDS. And globally, we've seen ISDS cases in many areas because foreign investors have really sued governments for actually, if the governments have tried to formulate policies of human rights and anything related to services. But the main cases have been in the area of natural resources. So so far, I mean, this is slightly old data, but out of about 1,200 ISDS cases, 195 cases related to mining, 217 cases electricity, gas, steam services, 50 in water services. So actually more than 50% of these cases have been in the area of mining, natural resources, and extractives. So these agreements have really helped natural resource grab and critical minerals grab. And they have also prevented climate action. In many cases, when governments have tried to take climate action, they have been sued. So this particular, the investment treaties and the ISDS, I would say, has played a major role in this natural resource grab. And you can see that, why would it be a gender sensitive issue? Because women use the forests for foraging. Women are dependent on water resources. They are the ones who have to get the water from the nearby well or whatever water resource, and they have to get it for drinking or for cultivation. And I have heard stories where, women had to walk across 2 villages to get water. And then when these are grabbed, these resources are grabbed, those rights of foreign companies is protected by such investment treaties. Women are now having to walk across 5 villages to get water. So those who are in a more marginalized, more politically and economically marginalized and vulnerable position, they will always bear a disproportionate burden of the cost. And this came out very clearly in Mariama's presentation also. So there have been many such, dispute ISDS cases in the area of natural resources. I will not go to it. But as I was saying, these actions have also prevented climate action. But there is also another way in which these trade agreements have prevented climate action. The Trump is asking all of us to give up our tariffs, right? Like US will actually double or triple or even make its tariff 20 times of what it was. I was just doing some comparison recently for India, and in some areas their tariff is actually going to increase 20 times, but they are asking us to cut our tariffs. But when developing countries cut their tariffs, they also lose tariff revenue. These tariff revenue, which they could use for climate measures, for putting in climate change actions and so on, in addition to, of course, spending on social protection, on health and education and so on. So we actually have lost a lot through these agreements. But the interesting thing is, now we are being given solutions, right? Trade and sustainability has become a huge issue in the WTO, also in the bilaterals, and especially the developed countries are very keen. EU is actually a kind of forerunner. So, for example, EU has, many of you must be familiar with the CBAMs, the Carbon Border Adjustment Measures, Deforestation Act. So, EU is punishing many countries, and mainly developing country exports are punished. They have to pay this tax at the border because they cannot meet these standards, right? Which makes it very difficult for them to actually hold on to these export markets. But EU says that, okay, these are for sustainability and so on. But frankly, a lot of these are false solutions. Firstly, these are unilaterally decided and imposed on partner countries. And then there's a study which shows CBAM led to only 0.1% reduction in carbon emission. And then, Deforestation Act, etc., it imposes huge cost on agricultural exports of developing countries. All the compliance measures, I mean, even if you are compliant, just to prove it, it's difficult. And women producers find it even more difficult to meet these tougher standards. So they'll be cut out from the trade market, you can be sure. They cannot get these certificates. They cannot meet these technical, these barriers. They cannot meet the climate action, the border measures on climate, right? So we are seeing that a lot of push in the WTO, in the FTAs, but also we are seeing this sustainable development chapter in the EU, which is, in principle, on paper, very well-meaning. But if you look at it, these are basically ways to keep developing countries from exporting. And within developing countries, as I said, women's rights groups, rural population, indigenous communities, they will find much more difficult to engage in or benefit from global trade given these. EU has things like, sustainable food systems chapters. I don't have the time to go into that. But if you look at those in detail, you will see these are false solutions. These are actually kind of misuse of the agenda. And so I would say that if any country or global north countries, if they were serious about climate and trade, they would actually address the ISDS. They would address these seed treaties. They would not push these, these industrialized kind of agricultural products into developing country markets and so on. So there are many ways where substantive provisions in these trade agreements could be changing for the better, but we don't see that happening. And then they should also stop imposing these unilateral standards actually on developing countries, because it hurts the most vulnerable the most. And then, and there are also these false kind of designing. For example, the EU is putting in, as I said, this sustainable food systems chapter in all its FTAs. You will see if your countries are signing with the EU, everybody must have agreed to this. But this has a very dangerous concept of, what is a sustainable food system. For example, it says any farmer or farming enterprise that does not pay taxes and that receives subsidy is unsustainable, which means small farmers in all our countries they should not exist, right? They should just disappear into thin air because they are unsustainable. So it has a very aggressive, very biased, I would say, kind of conceptualization of what is sustainable. And it is being actually used very aggressively in the trade agreements. And then let me just end by saying that in many times we are seeing in these trade agreements what are called soft law, very cooperation based. There'll be a committee that will oversee your climate measures, your sustainability efforts, and so on. But those slowly become hard obligations for global South countries. And the interesting thing is, in climate, finance, and technology, it's such a political, such a kind of explosive discussion. So in trade, we never hear of transfer of environment-friendly technology. We do not hear of transfer of finance when these discussions are coming in. So, for example, in fact, in the trade agreements, these intellectual property rights chapter, they are actually designed to keep control of technology in global north, because they are the ones who, and China to a certain extent, they are the ones who use the IPR system, basically. So we don't see the real solutions. We don't see substantive issues being addressed. We don't see any talk of finance and technology transfer. So in this context, of course, women's rights groups, because women are engaged in every segment of these impacts, right? Climate impacts women and the marginalized, the more vulnerable, much more than general, right? Everybody is impacted, but these constituencies are impacted more. And so therefore, I think it's very important for trade activists, feminist activists, movements, climate activists to really understand and come together. Because we often see that, I think maybe a climate activist will think, hey, I'm not getting any solution here in UNFCCC. It will be solved in the WTO. But we know nothing gets solved in a progressive way in the WTO. So we have to understand that there are these, double speak and false solutions and these complexities, how something is made to look very nice, or trade will be sustainable, developed country members are committed to that, and so on. But between the lines, there's a lot of politics, a lot of complexity. I think if all of us sit together, and feminist movements have always taken leadership roles on this, on understanding these nuances and understanding these various impacts on women's various roles. And I think we have to bring all that knowledge and the grassroots experience together and to fight it together. Otherwise, we are really losing out rapidly. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ranja, for that. It was very insightful, especially talking about how trade agreements impact climate, the sea treaties that we have that continue to impact trade, and women overall, as well as the bilateral investment treaties. I'd now like to pass it to Nela Porobić, who is from the Feminist Anti-Militarist Collective. And today, Nela will be speaking to us about the intersection between gender, trade, and conflict, including post-conflict. Nela, over to you.
Thank you so much, and thank you all for joining us, and of course the whole of Gender and Trade Coalition for organizing the event, and to my wonderful colleagues on the panel for very thought-provoking inputs. I should maybe start by saying that, unlike the two previous speakers, I'm really not a trade expert. I don't specifically look at trade or trade agreements in my work. I work mostly on a political economy of war and peace, and I look at feminist alternatives to currently very neoliberal processes of peace building, if we can even call it that. But trade is very much part of these processes. And before I go into any greater details about trade and conflict, let me just say that also, or introduce me a little bit better. I come from Bosnia and Herzegovina. It's a so-called post-conflict country. And I have in the past decade or longer probably been observing how trade, among other things, works as a tool of neoliberal capitalism, and how under the guise of peace building, it has also been used as a predatory tool. For those of you that are not familiar with Bosnia, Bosnia is a very small country in Southeast Europe. It's not a member of the European Union, and it's one of those countries that finds itself positioned between the capitalist core and the periphery, or global north and global south, as it's more popularly used. It's actually a semi-peripheral country that enjoys some of the perks of, being a country on the European continent, but also shares many of the experiences of the global south. It has been colonized. It is experiencing all the aspects of current forms of colonization and imperialism. It is a source of exploitation and extraction of resources and labor. And we've had an intensive experience of war in the 90s, and I would almost dare to say an even more intensive experience of post-conflict recovery and reconstruction that has been firmly embedded in neoliberal understanding of peace. Now, I'm not at all going to talk about Bosnia much or at all, but I wanted really properly to introduce myself or position myself so that you know and understand a bit better where my reflections are coming from. If we look at a previous period, right, or countries in conflict or coming out of conflict have struggled a lot with the neoliberal notion of peace building. The international community, led by international financial institutions, in particularly the World Bank and the IMF, has been very strongly advocating for this approach for a very long time. Their claim has been that the unquestionable foundation for peace and development, both within and between states, is, of course, market democracy. It is free trade. It is the healthy private sector. It's the regulated markets, the regulated labor laws, etc. And, of course, the integration of a country into the multilateral trading system. And according to this thesis, all of this combined will lead to stability and economic well-being. And also, on top of that, the assumption is that the countries that trade with each other will never go to war with each other. And we all know this is not true. And I think there are ample evidence that trade continues even during wars, many times actually even between the warring parties, without that trade actually having any positive effect on stopping the violence. Rather, it serves as a tool for enrichment of those that do the actual fighting. And there's also a level of exclusion of women from these deals, as there is a very patriarchal approach or understanding of conflicts, where women are always and only the victims, and they are never agents. And the only agents that exist in this patriarchal worldview are those holding weapons. Now, I think the escalation of this neoliberal approach that we are seeing today consists of a total financialization of peace and the so-called peace building, where shift is happening from focusing of the peace building away from interests of those that are most affected towards the interest of private actors, of the international financial institutions, of investment funds, of corporations, and individual states, and their interest is to maximize profit for lenders, for shareholders, for investors. And it is also under these premises that also trade deals are made. The prioritization, I think, of profit over people has always been true within capitalism, but now, as Mariama already spoke about, it's been so emboldened, and there is no need for them, I think, anymore to hide behind false narratives of security or promises of prosperity. Societies have really intensely and rapidly become consumed by militaristic thinking, and there is a readiness to wage war we have not seen since World War II, I think. And, many of us have lived through war or are living through wars and violence and fascism locally and regionally, but on a global scale, this willingness to destroy, to me, feels at least much more intense than before. And in that sense, and in a very strange way, I do appreciate the honesty in, for example, the US renaming its Department of Defense into Department of War, because factually that is true. And in the same way, I think we should stop calling peace building, and start calling it for what it really is, which is an extraction and exploitation processes that capitalize on people's trauma. I'm sure many of you remember how back in 2007, a Canadian author, Naomi Klein, she published a book called The Shock Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism, in which she showed how global capital uses people's trauma to push through laws and neoliberal policies that would otherwise most probably meet resistance. And I think we can all agree that war and conflict are among the most traumatizing events people and societies can go through, on top of the gendered violence and harms and death. There is forced displacement, there is hunger, homelessness, there is in general a precarity of life that is not easy to recover from, either for individuals or for the society. There is both structural and individual violence that is unleashed that brings exceptional trauma to people's lives. And then that trauma is then used to force open the markets for the global capital. And people's trauma has also been used to make money, even as the violence is ongoing. Francesca Albanese, the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the Palestinian territories occupied since 1967, has done an incredible job in her report in exposing how the economy of genocide looks like. And she has actually, among other things, showed how during the past years of Israel's genocidal war against the Palestinians and their lands, the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange has amassed $225.7 billion in market gains. I think it's also safe to say that these past genocidal years have changed also our global relationships forever. Multilateral system will never be the same, including in relation to trade. And maybe I should actually say that we should never allow it to be the same, to go back to normal. I think this has been things have changed, and we should not allow it to go back to things to business as usual. The governments that are ready to wage these wars or to sustain them materially and politically have, I don't think, have ever really engaged in trade for any other reason but their selfish interests. Their interests do not change when they are dealing with wars and conflict. If anything, they become even more predatory. People's needs are of very little interest. But in a conflict context, or a context that is recovering, people's general needs, which were mentioned already before by previous speakers, they are also compounded by the violence they have experienced. So people's labor that sustain communities during these times, and it is women mostly that perform this labor, is almost never valued in the aftermath. On the contrary, it is left to be dealt with by the so-called market forces, which then proceed to make profit out of it instead of enabling a recovery that is decent. If we look at, for example, Ukraine, there are many examples, but I'll just go through a few of them. For private corporations and elites today, not at least in the European Union and the US, the war in Ukraine has continuously actually been an opportunity to profit. The competition of Ukraine over Ukraine's natural resources has been fierce. And maybe some of you remember or paid notice that there was a deal signed early in 2025 between Washington and Kyiv, which gave access to the US to Ukraine's natural resources in exchange for US continuing to send and sell weapons to Ukraine. Then, of course, there is the fact that BlackRock, world's largest investment fund, is already the main driver of Ukraine's recovery process, under the slogan of Ukraine being actually the greatest opportunity for investors since Second World War. And then, I mean, as a matter of other examples, there is Trump's so-called, again, within quotes, historical peace deal between DRC and Rwanda. And if you look at that deal, the most important part of the joint declaration signed by the countries isn't their affirmation of their, what they call, unwavering commitment to peace, but actually that they also, on top of it, signed the Regional Economic Integration Framework, which, according to the White House, is a groundbreaking bilateral initiative that will unlock vast economic potential of the Great Lakes region for the US private sector. So this is not about peace, clearly. It's about exploiting people's and countries' precarious positions. It's about corporate interests, and it's about profit. There's nothing about people here. And I think it's clear that people in either Ukraine or Rwanda or DRC or Gaza have or could have sufficient bandwidth while the violence is being perpetrated against their bodies to oppose any of the deals on offer. But these deals are being made, and they will benefit the national and global elite, of course. They will finance these elites staying in power and enable them to accumulate more power and resources. But instead of these predatory approaches, what any country coming out of war needs are robust investments in infrastructure that heals. And by that, I don't only mean the healthcare sector, but of course that too, but also decent jobs, job security, access to land, clean water. As part of the recovery process and having been pushed out of the so-called formal economy, what we can observe in many post-conflict countries is that women then often take to small home-based production to extend their household budget. But they are actually then forced to compete with their products on markets where everything is cheaper than the goods they are actually able to produce. So sometimes this is more adding on to the depletion of women and making women more poor than they would have been if the domestic industries and the production had been restored and protected instead of domestic markets being overwhelmed by cheap products from abroad. Trade and its various mechanisms have played a role in destabilizing countries by, for example, creating asymmetric dependencies between countries. It has also been used as a soft power, but it has also been weaponized through, for example, sanctions. We can just look at what is happening to Cuba as we meet today. It has been used to subjugate countries. But of course, having said all this, trade isn't inherently bad. To use it as a tool of subjugation, extraction, and exploitation, it's a political choice. Under a different political economy, it could be a tool of mutual support and solidarity. And on that note, I would like to finish with some questions to help us think about how a feminist-informed trade exchange could look like in relation to wars and violence, which I think no longer are questions of local or regional methods, but basically a global reality. To begin with, I think we do need to understand how we want post-war or wars economies in general to look like, and then what role we want the trade to play in those economies that are in the function of sustaining peace rather than sustaining wars. And this question, again, is equally important, I think, locally, nationally, and globally. How do we imagine that? Mariama already spoke very well and extensively about women's care labor underpinning the formal economy today. So just a matter of summarizing and feeding into this previous question, I mean, some of the things I think we need to understand in our process of reimagining is what economic activities we want to value, what and whose labor we want to value, and how we want to value them moving forward. We can compare it to today. For example, military activities and weapons production is highly valued today and is a measurement of countries' economic success, while women's life-sustaining labor is devalued, is not part of the measurement at all. So how do we change that? These things, they might seem like a general questions, and in a way they are also general questions, but they do have serious implications for trade. Answering them and other questions can be the difference between ensuring that trade no longer is part of the shock doctrine trap and instead becomes a tool of solidarity, mutual support that can help countries actually recover from war and violence. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nela, for those great insights. Very useful, especially in terms of conceptualizing the intersection between trade, gender, and conflict, and how that continues to, first of all, erode from the resources, but also we continue to emphasize how women continue to bear the brunt with this. I would now like to open it up for comments or questions from any of the participants. Anyone who would like to contribute to this conversation, either by sharing a question or comment. You may also post your comments in the chat box, and we could pick it up from there. But yeah, please feel free to raise your hand in case you have a comment or question. Yes, Renee.
Good afternoon, good morning, depending from where you are. Thank you very much for organizing this very interesting meeting. I have a question addressed to our three experts. I'm representing an organization based in Berlin, Germany, from African descent, particularly from Cameroon, and we have been implementing projects trying to promote the financial independence of women in local areas. So, with regard to all what the perspective that you have shared with us in your respective inputs, I would like to have your concrete proposal suggestion on how we can enable women who are at the center of all the conversation we are having here, particularly those who are the most vulnerable one, meaning who are living in villages, to get involved or to get knowledgeable with what is currently happening worldwide and how those current changes that we're witnessing are going to impact our daily life. Because what we have seen is that people usually do not seem to be aware of how their daily life and the society, the way the society they live in is organized. It's linked with, for example, wars that is happening in Iran or in Gaza or, for a specific case, in Ukraine. So, and secondly, what are the basic tools that we can provide to small NGOs to be able to be active, to get involved in finding solutions, to still find a way to make that voice being heard in processes. The last question that I have is something that I've yet witnessed so far, but I think that while we have to hold stakeholders from the global north accountable regarding the current catastrophe that we are witnessing worldwide, we also have to hold the government in the global south equally accountable for exposing that population to all that violence that we're seeing. So has anyone witnessed stakeholder from the civil society mobilizing, for instance, to sue any government that have agreed, for instance, to sign the seed agreement that, for example, Mrs. Ranja mentioned, while fully being aware of how it's going to impact the people who are practicing agriculture in that country. So far from me, thank you.
Thank you for that, Renee. Does anyone else have a comment or question?
There's a comment in the chat from Metka.
Okay, let me just read that. I don't know if Metka would like to speak, or should I just go ahead and read it? Okay. I'll just read it. Hi, everyone. Great talk from everyone in studying and teaching law, including trade and international trade investment law and arbitration. I have not, until a few years ago, had any of these issues discussed. How familiar with this stage, the WTO or other forums are with all the issues you discussed? Is it a question of knowing, or are they much like in other forums, just ignoring the issues on feminist gender work? And then there's another question from Susanna. Is there funding available from the UN or otherwise for this initiative? Okay, so I don't seem to see any other hands that I will see. So I'll quickly go back to my panelists and ask them to respond to the question. You each have 2 minutes to respond and also share your parting shots. I'll start with Ranja.
Sorry, Grace, did you mention my name or
Yeah. I
okay,
said,
okay, yeah, fine. No,
yeah,
I just
just 2 minutes
sorry.
to,
Getting old cannot hear very well anymore. Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah. Thanks for the very interesting questions. And I mean, I have not worked so much on militarism and trade, and I'm sure Nela can answer the question related to, and it is a very important question. It's on all our minds that how are these current issues? One is, of course, war. We see the horrible and like ever expanding face of war. And then also these crazy trade policies. But it is definitely affecting not only, just that we are not getting fuel, it's getting expensive. It is on our doorstep. Today you see your neighbor being attacked, tomorrow you will be attacked. So, and then today you think your trade, you are going to produce, you're going to sell, you're going to export, you are safe, you can get everything you want through trade. But then tomorrow you see the rules have changed, and the rules are always changing in favor of those who are powerful. So if you're not able to control that, you're always at the receiving end. So whether it is our food security, whether it's our health security, because medicine prices, even the vaccines during COVID, they became so expensive, and in spite of efforts at the WTO, we could not take them off patenting, we could not make them cheaper, we could not make them available. So our food security, health security, our access to natural resources, our environment, everything is up for grabs. And like war militarism, if they are not using the military routes, they are using the trade routes, but the whole objective is to grab your natural resources, and you will be forever dependent, and you will face tremendous vulnerability and uncertainty, and the trade rules will forever be kind of adjusted and shaped to cater to that objective, mainly led by global north. This is one, but there was this other question of the WTO, whether they are picking up issues related to gender and also I would say climate and sustainability. Yes, they are. And actually, that's a major cause for concern because the GTC, in fact, came into being as a response to the WTO's 2017. There was a ministerial in Buenos Aires in Argentina. And this initiative called like Gender and Trade Initiative, it's the initiative for women's empowerment, something it was called. And the GTC was born actually as a response because we saw that the narrative and the framing of how they were discussing gender and trade is very problematic. So as Mariama was saying, it is, in many ways, women are impacted, but it's not a question of these tweaking and fixes. What the WTO and the main, global north countries who are leading the WTO, they would say is the agreements are all great, rules are all great. We'll just tweak it a little bit to make sure women also benefit. But that is not true. Women have been harmed, communities have been harmed, and those who are in a weaker position are being harmed. So it's a question of reshaping the agreement. So we see continuous effort to hijack the, gender and trade agenda, gender and trade and sustainability agenda. That's why I was saying we really need to understand the complexities, the multi-layered nature of these issues. And because these are politicized, these are become political tools and they will be used against us otherwise. I'll just end here. Yeah, thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Ranja, for that. I'll now move to Mariama to just use 2 minutes to respond to any of the questions and share your parting thoughts. Mariama?
Yeah, I'm thinking.
Okay.
Well, I think
Okay.
like the presentation from both Nela and Ranja covered a lot of the grounds that I would draw on for responding. I mean, I do appreciate, and I've been paying attention to the fact that the climate, extreme weather impacts agricultural products and agricultural production and food security. And it's particularly devastating for subsistence farmers, right? Because I've been recently in Jamaica, the aftermath of the Category 5 Hurricane Melissa, and see what that means for women's lives, not just in the destruction of physical and infrastructure, but also the intangible in terms of mental health and trauma that these impose. And I think the same thing is said for war and even for the tariff, the securitization of trade that's going on now. Certainly, we could speak of the Caribbean, where even our imports of doctors from Cuba many of our governments have now bowed to the US and are sending back the doctors from Cuba back, from Jamaica and other places, which is causing tremendous poverty and lack of access to health, in particular eye health for poorest of the poor. So all of these changes that are going on are not academic. They're not just about military. They're actually deep down that are affecting people's physical lives. The response then has to be that as civil society, because we don't have much other than being civil society, we redouble our efforts. We join up our protest movements, and we work with our local communities and governments to secure alternatives to the extent that governments are influenceable on some dimension. Now, it is the case that when you think of both trade liberalization and trade protection, trade liberalization, there was the idea that trade, we've shifted the ideology, the ideology that trade was supposed to bring welfare to all. Now it's that trade is supposed to protect national security. So there's a tremendous shift in the ideology about, at the level that if you accept that ideology, that shift signals a lot of things that are devastating for us, even as we were critical of the trade regime that were in place. That this new thinking around trade, the EU has shifted to strategic autonomy in its trade. We see all the proliferations of plurilateral and all of the various things that are occurring. So that it just means that we have to really regurge ourselves and deepen our struggles and also help to secure the rights that we can on the ground and help to foster greater cooperation and greater resources back to what community have access to. I mean, in our case in the Caribbean, communities have gone back to their traditional knowledge. They're drawing on community self-help because the help that comes in terms of immediate response, great. But 6 months or 3 months after the hurricane or a disaster, people are still struggling on the ground. So they naturally have to go back to kinship and various forms of things. So I think some of those recognition and linking our struggles, as I said, linking our struggles, trade, climate justice, we cannot struggle isolated anymore. We have to take into account the various ways and the various terrain of struggle. And even if we're not involved in those, we have to be aware of it and be supportive of those to see that at some level, in the case of Jamaica, what's becoming clear is that you can't fight for housing and land without changing the macroeconomic picture, without changing the governance structure, the constitutional governance structure, which we inherited from the British, that has a certain way that land is generated and utilized. So I think we begin to see that the macro, the meso, the micro, and even what people call the meta, all these different levels of struggles are integrated, and we have to be cognizant of them, those of us who have the luxury and the privilege to be able to do that, and work with those who are on the ground, struggling day to day, and making sure that our resources get to those people. And when we get resources, not just for our organization, but we have to find ways to communicate and to distribute those resources down. I think that's pretty much what I would say.
Thank you so much, Mariama. I'll now quickly pass it to Nela.
I don't have much more new to add to what was already said by Ranja and Mariama. So I wonder if you want to use the time, maybe somebody else had a comment, or because I would just be repetitive to already excellent comments, which I agree with. Or is this the closing word, Grace?
Yes, it's the closing.
Okay. I thought it was. No, then I will just read. I mean, that's what it was already said. But for me, all the conversations, and I'm always in kind of different conversations that are happening. It's trade, it's war, it's transitional justice, and whatnot. But it all comes down, I think, to this very moment we are in. And I think, as Mariama was saying, there is so much that we can observe that is wrong with the structures that surround us, right? That we really have to think deeper and differently about my point, like what I think we have to think differently about how we also understand power, how we want to, where are the places for democracy, which like we have this structure where our democracy is currently based only on elections, we go vote, then we have this government, and now we all do campaigns towards the government. For me, we are in a moment where I no longer can see that government serves the purpose of the people. So I would want to go, I think going locally and understanding where are the different tables for democracy, for our discussions on trade and all of the different things we have discussed here. Where can we find those tables, and can we create them ourselves? I think that for me is my big takeaway from not just this conversation, but in general of what is happening in the world. I think we need to rethink structures, and we need to do it a bit differently than have done thus far. We've had some successes, but I think moving forward, we need to both learn from successes and our failures in order to get the strategies right. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Nela. Great panel for everyone for insights. Thanks. We'll come to the end of this. I'd like to and if you'd like to join the mailing list, the link is in the chat as well. And a very great thank you to all the participants for joining, for the comments, the questions. They've all enhanced this conversation. We'll be having more of this, and I'd now like to wish you all a very and thank you everyone for joining. Have a good day.
We hope to see you all again soon. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Grace.
Thank you,
Thanks, Erica.
Grace.
Thank
Thank you to
you.
all of
Mariama.
the amazing
Bye,
everyone.
everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye everyone.
Say bye-bye. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, dear Ranja. Oh, and thank you to our wonderful interpreters.